during a very difficult time in 2009. I want to thank you. Your prayers were felt, and your prayers were used by God to sustain us in some pretty tangible ways. But to make a very long story short, I'm from the South Florida area, so is my wife, and we got married almost 17 years ago, moved away so that I could go to college and then seminary, and then we spent 2 years in Tennessee. So we were out of the South Florida area for 9 years, and then moved back in the summer of 2003, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, to plant New City Presbyterian Church. I was a remarkably reluctant church planter. I never wanted to plant a church. In fact, I was absolutely convinced that church planting was the one thing God had not called me to do. All of my buddies in seminary who wanted to plant churches were, math majors and engineering majors, and they were guys who loved administration and detail, and I was a philosophy major, and it was very conceptual, big ideas, and I never thought in 1,000 years that I would plant a church. But after God wrestled both Kim, my wife, and me to the ground in the summer of 2003, we moved to South Florida at the request of about 70 people to start a church, New City. God was doing great things in the church, doing great things through the church. The church grew fast, especially in its first year, and we were thrilled and excited about it. And right about the time the church turned 5 years old, I was approached by Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, which had been for many, many years a well-known, established church in the Fort Lauderdale area, about 9 miles southeast of where New City was. And they approached me and asked if I would consider becoming the new pastor. Their founding pastor, Dr. D. James Kennedy, had passed away about a year earlier. The church was founded in 1959. Some of you may know, Dr. Kennedy is well known for establishing Evangelism Explosion, which is an evangelistic ministry that is in every country in the world. The church was made especially well known by virtue of the fact that it was on television on a weekly basis for many years. And so he had died in September of 2007. He had been sick for a year before that and was out of the pulpit. So the church had been effectively without leadership in the form of a pastor for close to 2 years. And when their pulpit committee gathered to figure out what to do, they had, of course, never been in this situation before. This church had only had one pastor. And so they were exploring brand new territory themselves. And my name came up, and they approached me and asked if I would consider going through the process to become the next pastor. And I was honored, I was humbled, but I said resolutely, I'm not interested. And it became relatively apparent to me that while everybody else in the world knew that, number one, whoever follows a founding pastor is going to have an incredibly difficult time. Everybody knew that. It didn't seem like they knew that. Two, it was a church that, even though it hadn't dwindled down to 7 people, it was a church in need of real revitalization. It had been declining for about 10 years. Most people think of Coral Ridge as this huge mega church. It was far from that by the spring of 2008. It was a large church, but it wasn't a mega church in terms of thousands and thousands of people. And so I said, listen, I'm humbled, I'm honored, but I'm not interested. About 3 months later, they came back and asked if I would reconsider. And again, I said, I'm humbled, I'm honored, but I'm not interested. I expressed at that point that God had me at my post, that there was no way that I could ever conceive of leaving where I was to go 8 or 9 miles down the road. And for those of you who have planted churches, you know that while the church does not belong to you, it belongs to Christ. He purchased her. It feels like when you start a church from scratch, when God uses you to plant a church, that you've given birth to a baby. And so I could never in 1,000 years imagine leaving where I was to go down the street. Well, they continued the process of looking for a pastor, and in December of 2008, they came back to me, and that's when the conversation about possibly merging the two churches happened. And it was an intriguing idea because we were a church that had two services meeting in a high school auditorium. It was a beautiful facility, but we were actively looking for permanent space. We were outgrowing our space and looking for permanent space. So we were looking for a building, and we had explored churches in our area that were dying and talking to them, and none of them were interested. They didn't know they were dying. Everyone else did, but so they weren't interested. But so we kept looking around, and so on paper this looked intriguing. Okay, a church without a building that needs leadership and vision and a shot in the arm, becomes a partner with a church that has no building. So it seemed like a good idea. All of us, of course, knew that this was going to be an incredibly difficult thing. Although the churches were both Presbyterian churches, and so in that sense they were theologically similar, culturally, demographically, stylistically. I mean, there were a lot of differences. Even philosophically, there were a lot of differences as far as how to approach our particular city of Fort Lauderdale and what ministry is supposed to do and that sort of thing. So we knew it was going to be terribly challenging, but we decided to explore it. Our guys on our side said this is either a major satanic distraction or it's a major unconventional move of God, and there's no way we're going to be able to know which one it is until we sit down and really explore. So a team of people from Coral Ridge, their elders, and a team of people from New City, our elders, along with me, met over a period of 4 months. We met every week for about 3 hours on, I think it was Thursday nights, for 3 or 4 months, and we went through a meticulous due diligence process. We examined everything philosophically, financially, structurally. We looked at all of the personnel issues. You name it. We explored everything. We looked under every rock and behind every tree, and really did explore everything. And at the conclusion of that time, it was a very painful process on a number of fronts. For me, number one, God was potentially calling me to put my baby, on the altar. And I loved my baby, and I didn't want to put my baby on the altar, especially knowing the challenges that would await us if we moved to Coral Ridge. But also, it was remarkably challenging just because we knew it was going to be extremely difficult trying to merge these two very different cultures into one church family. But after a period of 4 months, God made it very clear to all of us, abundantly clear to all of us, that this is in fact what He wanted us to do. And so the churches came together, both elder boards voted in favor of the merger, and then the congregations voted in favor of the merger, and on Easter Sunday 2009, the two churches came together under one roof as one new church for the very first time, and it was unbelievable. I mean, it was celebratory, it was remarkable, and for one split, terribly naive second, I thought, wow, this may not be as difficult as I thought it was going to be. And the honeymoon lasted for about 10 days. And then all of the fireworks that we anticipated started to go off. All of the difficulties that we anticipated started to happen. And it got really hot, and it got really ugly very fast. And I became the father of a blended family that was not getting along, where the siblings were not getting along. And there was a lot of, well, we do it this way from both sides. Even though the New City was only, at that time, 6 years old, there was still a lot of, well, this is the way we did it in New City. There was actually a lot of unintended self-righteousness on both sides. This group thinking the way they did it was better, and this group thinking the way they did it was better. But most of the initial issues that we faced came from some of the old guard at Coral Ridge, and some of the people who had occupied for many, 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 many years places of relatively significant influence and power. And my coming in with our elders and our, deacon board and our staff and our church, it represented to them a loss of power, a loss of influence, a different seat at the table. And so that's really what started to fuel the fire. And all of that really, started to get very bad going into the summer of 2009, where I was at the end of my rope. I had never been a discouraged or depressed guy up until that point. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, it was terrible. Things that were being said about me, the slander, the lies, the rumors, it was just absolutely miserable, absolute misery. And I thought to myself, God, what are you doing? Literally, what are you doing? It was so clear to me that this is what you wanted to see happen. Did I get it wrong? I'm a Calvinist. I don't believe that there are plan Bs. But my theological knees were knocking, and I was thinking to myself, what are you doing? Literally, everybody's miserable. And I basically begged him to give me my old life back. And as some of you have heard me say before, he reminded me through Colossians chapter 1, which is what the book Jesus Plus Nothing Equals Everything will be talking about. He reminded me that it wasn't really my old life I wanted back, it was my old idols I wanted back, and he loved me too much to let me keep them. And it was at that point that I realized I had never, ever realized how dependent I had become on human approval and human acceptance until God took it away. And so what I initially thought was God's purpose in doing surgery at a dying church, namely Coral Ridge, and how we were the answer, okay, very self-righteously and arrogantly concluding we were the answer. I was now on the receiving end of the surgeon's scalpel and realizing that more than Coral Ridge needing me, I needed Coral Ridge because it was the tool that God was using to show me my own idolatry. It's amazing what happens. As a church planner, it was a huge struggle for me. If there were a lot of people on Sunday morning, I felt like a success. If the numbers were down, I felt like a failure. If the giving was up, I felt like a success. If the giving was down, I felt like a failure. And so much of me was tied up in the success of this particular church that I concluded if this church doesn't do well, I don't do well. And if this church does well, I do well. So much of my identity was anchored in how the church was doing. And I was seeing that for the very first time after the merger. And so it was God's way of revealing all of those pseudo-saviors that I had been depending on that were smaller than Jesus to give my life meaning and significance and purpose and value and all of those things. So in that sense, it was the most painful thing I ever experienced. It was the best thing I ever experienced. Well, we made it through the summer of 2009, barely hanging on. The group that was opposed to our leadership was successful in serving a petition to the elder board, which forced us to have a congregational meeting that took place on September 20th, 2009. The people who wanted me gone as the pastor lost that vote and immediately went and started their own church. So we've planted a church. We call it a splant. We're taking credit for it. For all those people put us through, we're taking credit for it. So they left and they started their own church. And probably 2 months after, for the next 3 months, from September to December, we were really picking up the pieces and licking our wounds and really shepherding people, helping people. It was a hard time in the life of our church. In one sense, everybody was breathing easier because the war was over, but there was still a lot of stuff to clean up after the battle. And right about Christmas of 2009 is when we felt God help our church turn the corner. And since that time, I am pleased to say, and I tell people this all the time, that God has seen fit to launch a gospel riot at Coral Ridge. The church is more than surviving, it's thriving. It's just been a remarkable thing, and so much of what you described, Mike, about the older people who stuck with you and how their own personal faith has been revitalized. It's been probably one of the most rewarding things for us to see happen, that some of these people who had been there for so long and whose faith had pretty much gone dry. I mean, people in their 70s and 80s coming and saying, I feel alive for the first time in 20 years because of the way that God is pressing the gospel down deep into my bones, and I'm seeing things in a new way, and all of those things. And so it's been a remarkable testimony to God's work. But I'm a huge fan of church replanting, church revitalization. Not that I have anything against church planting. I planted a church and I loved it. But like you said, Mike, I mean, it does demonstrate, I think, the power of redemption and reconciliation and what it means to go from death to life in a way that's almost more tangible than planting a church from scratch. And like you said, there are a lot of churches in our area that are struggling and dying too, and they're sitting in a building with a lot of property. And, you know, I mean, not only is it a bad testimony, but it's just simply wise and good stewardship to explore those options first. I remember Tim, when I was going through all of this stuff, and Tim Keller was a great counselor to me, but I remember him saying something to me over the phone once, like, you know, how many church planters in the course of a year spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars